Now, today's lecture is going to be on Mar Timotheus, or Timothy, the Patriarch of the Church of the East from 780 to 823, one of the longest reigning patriarchs of the Church of the East, Mar Timotheus I, a very important personality, a very significant personality for the Church of the East and for his time. And we're also going to look at the missionary enterprise of the Church of the East, one of the greatest missionary enterprises in the history of the world. Let's recall where we've been and where we are going. Important to know that the Assyrian Empire collapsed in 609 BC. Assyrians came at that time under the rule of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, which lasted up to 539 BC. At that time, the Achaemenids came to power. We know that Assyrian identity continued during this time. It was attested to in archaeological records, in contemporaneous accounts, that the name Assyrian comes up, Assyrian names come up repeatedly. Assyrian identity survives during this time. It certainly survives during the conquest of the Achaemenids, who ruled in Mesopotamia up until 330 BC, when Alexander came rolling into Mesopotamia, into Assyria, and into Babylon, and took over the Achaemenid Empire. From 247 BC, after the rule of the Seleucids, which followed Alexander, Parthians came to rule Assyria, and we know that Assyrian existence continued on during the time of the Parthians. We're talking now 200s, 300s BC, all the way up to AD 200, 224 to be precise. At 224 AD, the Sasanians come to rule Assyria, and the Church of the East and the Syriac Orthodox Church developed during this time and form recognized communities until the arrival of Islam. In 651 AD, Islam arrives, and we have the Pact of Omar, which is a very important document for understanding relations between Christians and Muslims during this time. Now, I should tell you, when it comes to Islamic history, there's a lot of debating, a lot of rediscovering, a lot of reanalyzing of what came when and who was important in Islamic history, and whether Muhammad, the prophet, really existed or not, the prophet of Islam. 750 AD, Abbasids rule until their fall to the Mongols. And this is a very important period of time, and this concerns us in particular when we're dealing with Patriarch Mar Timotheus of the Church of the East, who was born around 740, although some say later, and ruled as patriarch from 780 until 823 AD. Then we have the arrival in 1070, arrival of Seljuk Turks, some of whom had become Christians, by the way, through the Church of the East. And then the arrival of the Mongols, and finally, in 1390, Timur had conquered Syria, and according to Badger, had been the reason why many Assyrians had left the plains of Nineveh and the plains of Erbil and escaped or fled to the Hakkari Mountains and other places surrounding the Assyrian heartland. So in other words, we have Badger and others who have written about Assyrians, saying that the existence of the Assyrians and the Hakkari, and we're talking about the tribes, for example, of Diari and Jilu and Tkhuma and Baz and others in the Hakkari Mountains, this is really the result of the coming of Timur, who caused much devastation in the Assyrian plains in 1390 or around 1400, and led to the destruction of many Assyrian towns and villages, and caused the fleeing of many Assyrians into these lands in Hakkari. Now, some people, some scholars think that actually the existence of the Assyrians in the Hakkari area predates that much earlier. Assyria during Islamic rule. 3 points here are very important. The Muslim invasion or the Arab invasion was not sudden and quick, especially as it concerned the Assyrian heartland. Islam did not invade as a religion. It became oppressive later, and there's much speculation about this. We're not going to go into it today, but important that you remember that there's a lot of reanalyzing of how much different was this Islamic movement from Christianity, from different forms of Christianity, or even Judaism when it first emerged. And I'll make reference to some scholars who think that it was a movement of, quote unquote, the believers, people who were monotheists and who really did not distinguish themselves from other Christians, from Christians and Jews until much later. It became oppressive later. Islam became oppressive later for Assyrians and slowed and then halted the growth of the churches. That includes the Church of the East and the Syriac Orthodox Church. The process of decline was slow during different times, and it continues today. The decline of the number of Assyrian Christians certainly has declined, and it continues to this day. Assyrians and Christians in Mesopotamia contributed to the intellectual culture of the Abbasids, the age of translation that sparked, quote, the Islamic Golden Age, which in turn sparked the European Renaissance, was due in large part to the heritage of Mesopotamia, to the existence of the Assyrians, who were very learned and had gotten their learning not through a vacuum, but it had been transmitted through the ages, really for centuries, from the ancient times of the Assyrians all the way present into the times of the Abbasids, and earlier the Umayyads, but in particular the Abbasids. Assyrian Christians had internal conflicts, important to remember. Clergy were in part rulers of the community. And I mean, you have to remember that there were no political parties, there were no secular leaders during this time. The clergy acted as rulers of the community, and the Church of the East and the Syriac Orthodox Church were in conflicts with each other, but also helped to keep their communities coherent and in existence. So it was a two-way street, as it were. The Church of the East and the Syriac Orthodox Church, where most of the Assyrians belonged. Now, different references could be Syriacs or Aramaeans. I use the term Assyrian because I believe it is historically accurate. Most of the Assyrians belong to these two churches, and it is through these institutions, both their religious gravitational force and administrative and political force, which gathered these people together, that the people existed or continued to exist as a collective entity until this day. Now, what does that mean? We can ask questions about this and analyze it in detail, but the truth is that these were the only institutions to which people gravitated. And of course, we will see by studying Timothy or Mar Timotheus, we will see the slow disintegration of this gravitational force which these churches held, and up until today, that the secularist movement in the West is doing quite a job on the existence of the legitimacy of the churches. And here, of course, we're talking about all churches in the West. So Mesopotamia was known as Asuristan during Sasanian times. Asuristan was all of Mesopotamia, whereas we know from our history class that the Assyrian heartland really is in the northern Iraq, what is today northern Iraq, northeastern Syria, southeastern Turkey, and northwestern Iran. That's the Assyrian heartland. But in the past, the entire land of Mesopotamia was known as Asuristan. The last years of the Sasanian Empire, prior to the fall of the Sasanian Empire to the Arab Islamic armies, the Church of the East was undergoing turmoil. The Sasanian king had forbidden the election of a new patriarch. There was pressure on the Church of the East. The Church of the East had grown close to the center of power, and this center of power was a double-edged sword, of course. The power, the earthly power, could interfere into church affairs and did so many times. And we will see this again with the example of Mar Timotheus in his relations with the Abbasids. The seat remained vacant until the death of the Shah in 628. The Church of the East became rife with internal quarrels, disagreements among ecclesiastics regarding the central authority of the Patriarch. This was an ongoing issue. Believe it or not, until very late in the history of the Church of the East, this was a continuing issue. It was an issue with the Roman Catholic Church, but not so much of late, let's say. Rise of competing Syriac Orthodox hierarchy, which refused to accept the authority of the Patriarch of the Church of the East. This happened later as the Syriac Orthodox Church came into Mesopotamia and got many adherents who were previously members of the Church of the East to become members of the Syriac Orthodox Church. During this period, the Syriac Orthodox Church organized itself within Sasanian territory. Territory now of the Syriac Orthodox Church becomes Syria, which was under Byzantium, and Mesopotamia under the Sassanids, or under the Sasanians. And a Mafrian governs Mesopotamia. So whereas the Patriarch of the Syriac Orthodox Church was outside of the Sasanian area and in what is Syria, Byzantine Syria, the Mafrian, who was the person lower than the Patriarch, was governing Mesopotamia through the town of Tikrit. Began with the consecration of Marmarutha. This church began with the consecration of Marmarutha of Tikrit in 628 to 649 as the head of the Syriac Orthodox Church in Sasanian territory. So that was the Mafrian. Marmarutha, by the way, had belonged to the Church of the East and had switched sides. And we will see, for administrative or political reasons, members of the Church of the East, and as well as members of other churches, switch to even the Islamic faith for purposes of upward mobility in administrations or politics. So very important to get kind of a grasp of how the Arabs and the Turks and the Mongols affected Assyrian history for about 1,000 years, how this came about, what exactly happened. Now, with all of these peoples, Arabs, Turks, and Mongols, they all came from different places and settled in Mesopotamia. So the Arabs came largely from what we think of as Saudi Arabia today, or what is Saudi Arabia today, although there's speculation that other cities outside of Saudi Arabia played a role. And I'm not going to get into these theories, but I just want you to know that some people are questioning this theory of how the Arabs came out, whether it was a band of people just very lightly armed and doing miraculous things because of God's interference, or whether they were really people trained by the Sasanians and the Byzantines, who were disciplined armies and who had a lot to do with the takeover, is a question. It's a toss-up. These peoples, Arabs, Turks, and Kurds, came into more advanced societies. They adopted the administration and civilization of the societies they conquered. They left their homelands and found their centers or capitals in the societies they conquered. Assyrians move or are driven away from the center to periphery, or assimilate, or are massacred. So the Assyrians, in particular, in the Assyrian heartland, where the main Assyrian cities were, It's at this time that there is major displacement and also, as we will find out today, assimilation into the larger Muslim culture, something that becomes larger. At first, Christians are the larger entity, Aramaic speaking or Assyrian Christians are the larger group in Iraq, but they've slowly become a minority. It's over a period of hundreds of years. Who were the Arabs? The very first mention we have of a people called the Arabs are in Assyrian sources. And there's a reference by Shalmaneser III. It's the very first time, I believe, that we see in the written sources a gentleman by the name of Gindibu, or a king, or a small chief, perhaps, a small tribal leader, Gindibu the Arab, and his 1,000 camels. So at times, the Arabs are very friendly with the Assyrians. At times, they rebel. For example, during the time of Sarhaddon, the Assyrian king who is invading Egypt, the Arabs come to his aid by delivering many camels who are able to assist the Assyrian army to cross the Sinai into Egypt and eventually victoriously conquer Egypt. And that was the role of the Arabs then. But at other times, during the time of Ashurbanipal, for example, they rebel with his brother against the Assyrian king in Nineveh, and they are punished. And in fact, the relief that you see here is from the time of Ashurbanipal, who dealt a great defeat on various Arab chiefs who had worked with his brother at a time when there was a civil war in Assyria. Now, not all Arabs were Muslims. In fact, it is likely, according to many scholars, that they belong to a community of believers. Fred Donner at the University of Chicago believes that this is the case. In fact, he wrote an entire book about this subject, that it's difficult to identify these people who had been with the prophet known as Muhammad, that they had been a separate religious group. In fact, they may have been a community of believers, mu'mineen in Arabic, and that were monotheists like Jews and Christians. In fact, many of them had names that were similar names to Christians and Jews, and so they may have been no different than Christians and Jews. So this is an ongoing debate among scholars right now. Some were polytheists, certainly, and others were Christians or Jews. They became the minority of settled peoples in Mesopotamia and Assyria. Later, aided by Islam, Arabization took over the Near East, and as people adopted Arab administration, the Arabic language, and eventually Islam, the Arab language and people, and eventually the Arab identity took over the entire Near East. And we have the growth of something called Arab nationalism very late in the 19th century. And we will talk about that when we talk about the growth of Assyrian nationalism. And by the way, ironically, it was Christians who had really led to the initiation of, one could say, Arab nationalism. Bustanchi and Yazigi, and these are names that you will become familiar with, who were Syrian Christians or Maronites or members of the Syrian Byzantine Orthodox Church primarily, who led this initiation of Arab nationalism. That comes much later. Sasanian and Byzantine empires on the eve of Arab conquest. So there were many conflicts going back and forth, and the Assyrians, as you could tell on the map, fell on both sides of the border that was constantly shifting. And we have passages from Shapur in the first Roman campaign and in the second Roman campaign. And he says in the first campaign, and when I ascended the throne of the empire, Gordinius, the Caesar, assembled a force from all of Rome, Gothia, Germania, and came to Asuristan, it's Assyria, against the empire of Iran and us. Us, the reference to us is His Royal Highness as king. It's always in the plural. And at Misig, the frontier of Ashuristan or Asuristan, there was a great frontal battle. Of the second Roman campaign, he says, and the Caesar lied again, and he did wrong to Armenia. And we, meaning the king and his army, moved into the Roman Empire and destroyed 60,000 of the Roman force and burned, laid waste, and made captive all of Assyria and its surroundings. And here he refers to Assyria as Ashuria Shar, just like Iran Shahar is referred to as the empire of Assyria. The empire of Iran, Iran Shah, he refers to Assyria in the same way. So this is just to show that there was recognition that there was an Assyria and that there were Assyrians during this time. Now, with the coming of the Islamic conquest, the Assyrians came under the rule of the Rashidun in the beginning, under the Umayyad Caliphate later, and under the Abbasids later still. And you can see kind of the growth of Islam from the time of Muhammad, although technically it's questionable whether Muhammad led any sort of campaigns, military campaigns outside of the Arabian Peninsula. There's questions as to whether even this character is real in history or whether it's a metaphor for someone. Be that as it may, the Islamic Empire grew first under the Arabs, and later it will grow under the Turks as they become the Ottomans, and later under the Mongols as well, who adopt Islam. First, they adopt Christianity under the Church of the East, not all of them, of course, and not all Turkic people. And then later they will adopt Islam. What do we really know about Muhammad in the beginning of Islam? According to one scholar writing early on in the 19th century, French historian Ernest Renan, says that Islam was born in the full light of day. Unlike Christianity, for example, Renan believed that Muhammad was a definite figure and he was a military leader who was a very capable person. But later scholars began to question this idea of a real person leading a real army and conducting real warfare at very specific times, and began to question all of the writings that came really hundreds of years later. And according to Fred Donner, who is a very reputable historian at the University of Chicago, he is of the opinion that we just don't know because evidence is unreliable from this time. Now, one of the things he looks at is coins, another thing he looks at is textual evidence, but we just don't have the archaeological evidence, for example, for the existence of this movement that comes out and takes over Mesopotamia and later the entirety of Mesopotamia, Assyrians included. What's important to know about the Caliphate? The Rashidun caliphs were the very first caliphs. Now, Caliph, the word in Arabic, or khulafa, the plural, comes from the Assyrian word khlap, which is really someone who is instead of or is a deputy of God, so someone who's representing. Khlap is an Assyrian word, and Khalif comes from the Assyrian word. Abu Bakr, Omar, Uthman, and Ali were the first caliphs, and then comes the Umayyad Caliphate, 661 to 750, and then finally 750, the Abbasid Caliphate comes. Not important for you to keep these dates in mind, other than to know that the character we will focus in on today, Mar Timotheus, comes during the Abbasid Caliphate. So the word Caliph comes from the Assyrian, just as the word sultan also comes from the word Assyrian, which is sultana or shalita. So just so you know the origins of these words. The first four caliphs were called Ar-Rashidun, which means rightly guided: Abu Bakr, Omar, Uthman, and Ali ibn Talib. This is where the schism happens between Shia and Sunnah. The impact on Assyria is not as profound as in southern Mesopotamia, where obviously the movement of Arab peoples is more concentrated, less in the north. Material evidence shows that Nineveh was a main center during both Parthian and Sasanian times, and even during Islamic times. Mosul is established across from Nineveh, according to one legendary source, by a monk who simply crosses the river, because Nineveh happens to be on the western side of the Tigris, eastern side of the Tigris River. Mosul is on the western side of the Tigris River. He crosses the river and he settles, and that becomes Mosul. Although most historians think that Mosul has an earlier history than that, less significant than Nineveh, of course, but now, as you look at Mosul today, it has encompassed not only the entire area of the western side of the Tigris, but it also kind of surrounded the ancient city of Nineveh and turned it into a small area within the larger city of Mosul. During the time of Umar ibn Khattab, 584-644 AD, the empire expands, the Islamic Empire. He has a treaty with a group of Christians who surrender and imposes restrictions on them in terms of building churches and dress and the like. Scholars question the authenticity of this pact, but it is clear that Islamic rules pervade the ancient Near East and impact non-Muslims, and this goes on up until the present. In fact, I like to refer to some of these laws that were in place really up until our day. For example, in Egypt, in order to build a church, special permission had to be granted by the president, and even to repair churches which were in disrepair. The same does not go for mosques. And so there are many rules like this throughout the Islamic world, and we will talk about a few of them as they relate to Assyrians. In some areas, they are more strict. In certain areas, they are more lax. But certainly, overall, they have evolved to the point where they have pressured non-Islamic majorities to become really minorities over time. Various historical sources show that Christian bishops asked for exemptions, but not for the general population, only for priests, bishops, and hermits, which is really the power structure of the Christians. As pressure and violence increases, movement is away from Christianity and towards Islam. And we will refer again to Mar Timotheus and his canons to show that Islamic presence is growing among non-Muslims, and there is a drive for upward mobility towards becoming a Muslim. What we do know from historical sources is that the Battle of Qadisiyah, something that Saddam mentioned when he was in his war with Iran, as if he inherited the drive or the spirit of the Qadisiyah. In fact, he named various weapons or armies using this terminology. The Arabs defeated the Sasanian forces in Mesopotamia and brought about the destruction, disintegration, and the eventual disappearance of the Sasanian Empire. Not so with the Byzantines, although Byzantines suffered great losses on the western side of the Islamic Empire, but they were not able. The Muslims were not able to penetrate all the way to Constantinople. That would come much later. As we said, in the beginning, Islam included Christians and Jews, but not polytheists. After the Hijrah of Muhammad, speculation, and especially after Abdul Malik, a more defined definition of Islam came about. And I will introduce you to this quote, which sets a border between Christians and non-Christian, Christians and Muslims, or Muslims and non-Muslims. Assyrian Christians were not certain what to make of this faith in the beginning. Later, as restrictions became more clear, concern was expressed on the part of the Christians that, and we have various passages referring to a plague type of a situation because of our sins. The Assyrians began to see the coming of the Arabs as a type of punishment by God because they had not adhered to their faith, had not adhered to their religion. And so this type of a plague, this conquest by the Arabs had come about. Certainly not in the beginning, as we said, because the clashes of the Byzantines and the Sasanians came to endanger and came to cause a great deal of damage for the peoples that were on the borders, particularly the Assyrians and also the Armenians, because they fell at this center geographic area where both empires were clashing and the borders were shifting back and forth towards the east and towards the west. What did Muhammad preach? Message of monotheism against the prevailing polytheism. But Arabia had many Jews and Christians as well. It looks as if its message for the Arabs is to the unity of God based on Judaism and Christianity. It is an Abrahamic faith, according to Patricia Crone. And I like this quote by Patricia Crone, who passed away some years ago. And it's too bad that she is not with us anymore. She was one of the very first to question the chronology of the Muslim faith, as scholars had repeated it based on really textual information and not so much archaeological evidence. It is a peculiar habit of God's that when he wishes to reveal himself to mankind, he will communicate only with a single person. The rest of mankind must learn the truth from that person and thus purchase their knowledge of the divine at the cost of subordination to another human being who is eventually replaced by a human institution so that the divine remains under other people's control. Interesting observation. Now, we have eyewitness accounts. Questionable whether they're eyewitness accounts or someone has heard something, but we have the writings in the Assyrian or Syriac language about these encounters. In the year 945, and of course, 945 refers to the Greek year, Shita Dionae, as it is referred to in the Assyrian language. At the 9th hour, so there's this exact time, there was a battle between Romans and the Arabs of Muhammad. And this is the very first time this term is mentioned in history that we know of that can be dated. In Palestine, 12 miles east of Gaza, the Romans fled, leaving behind the patrician, whom the Arabs killed. Some 4,000 poor villagers of Palestine were killed there, Christians, Jews, and Samaritans. The Arabs ravaged the whole region. So this is a reference. Now, scholars are debating whether this can be reliable or not because it just does not match other records. But there is this reference to the Arabs of Muhammad, whatever that means. No one, Tayyayid Muhammad, referring to a tribe, not Arabiya, as the term is known in Assyrian today. Tayyaya is also a reference to a particular tribe that was referred to by Assyrians who encountered the Arabs in those years. In the year 947 or 635 to 36, the Arabs invaded the whole of Syria and went down to Persia and conquered it. The Arabs climbed the mountain of Mardin and killed many monks there. In the monasteries of Qidar and Bnata, there died the blessed man Simon, doorkeeper of Qidar, brother of Thomas the priest. So there are references to these encounters. Some of them are violent, some are not violent. This is from the Gospel of Matthew, going back to the year 640 AD. In January, the people of Hims took the word of their lives, surrendered, and many villagers were ravaged by the killing of the Arabs of Muhammad, and many people were slain and taken prisoner from Galilee as far as Beth, on and on. On the 26th of May, I believe this is the Saccharins, went from the vicinity of and the Romans chased them. On the 10th of August, the Romans fled from the vicinity of Damascus, and there were killed many people, some 10,000. Now, the Arabs took over Damascus prior to taking Jerusalem. And slowly, what these sources tell us is that the Arabs are moving along the Levant, taking over and pushing back the empire of the Byzantines. So with this conquest, really what we're seeing is a military force and a political force. There's a question of whether this is a religious force. And that does not really come into play until quite a few decades later, when Abdul Malik comes to power and we begin to see that he has a new vision of Islam. It seems like that is really a separate faith based on a Quran that has come together there later. There's a redefinition of the core group of this Islam. Dome of the Rock critiques the concept of the Trinity, for example, and it tells Christians, "O you people of the book, overstep not bounds in your religion, and of God speak only the truth. The Messiah, Jesus, son of Mary, is only an apostle of God. Believe therefore in God and his apostle, and say not three," in other words, Trinity. "It will be better for you. God is only one God, far be it from his glory that he should have a son." We will see this this topic come up in the debate between the Caliph of Abbasid Islam, Al-Mahdi, and Mar Timotheus, the Patriarch of the Church of the East, and we will see what he will say. So important to know that the millet system, which existed in the Sasanian times, during Sasanian times, is really kind of adopted by the new forces that now have a different religion and the elites are of a different ethnicity. They're no longer Zoroastrians, they are now Muslim. As various properties are taken or confiscated, the movement of Christians is away from the cities. Very important to keep this in mind. This is really the emptying out of various cities that Assyrians had been in and were the majority. For example, Nineveh, Mosul, Erbil, and so on. Slowly, as properties are confiscated, as pressure is placed on Christians, there is a movement away from the cities and into the countryside. Now, Abdul Malik has an interesting coin, very reminiscent of, as we see here, although it says, La ilaha illallah, Muhammadur Rasulullah, meaning there is no God, but Allah, but God, and Muhammad is his messenger. We see the style of the coins this is a copper coin from the period. This is very like the Byzantine. So there's an adoption of both Byzantine and Sasanian motifs, but the empire is slowly changing. It is really advancing a different type of ideology, but its culture is still the culture of the Byzantine and the Sasanians, both. And this is an Assyrian chronicle from Ahmed that tells us Abdul Malik carried out a ta'dil on the Syrians or Suraya. He issued a harsh order that everyone go to his region, village, and father's house so that everyone would register his name, his lineage, his crops and olive trees, his possessions, his children, and everything he owned. From this time, the jizya began to be levied per capita. Al-Rishid Nashe, each person. From this time, all the evils were visited upon the Christians. Until this time, the kings had taken tribute only from the land rather than from men. From this time, the sons of Hagar began to inflict on the sons of Aram servitude, like the servitude of Egypt. Woe is to us, because we sinned, slaves now rule us. This was the first ta'dil that the Muslims carried out. So we see a reference here, by the way, the sons of Aram oftentimes is used because the language being spoken by the Assyrian people is Aramaic. And so sometimes biblically, this is the preferred way, whereas Assyrians are oftentimes, once Christianity takes hold, are viewed from the perspective of the Old Testament as being the people who really persecute, who are the overlords. And so sometimes seeing ourselves as the underclass is more reasonable, according to the Christian view at this time. But you see here the change in policy. At first, Assyrians begin to see some hope with the arrival of the Arab Islamic forces, and then we begin to see the oppression. Once these powers settle in, we begin to see a greater centralization by Abd al-Malik, and this means that Christians are going to suffer. Any non-Muslim is going to suffer and be counted as a possible target of a jizya, which is to be paid by all non-believers. Now, what did the Assyrian Christians say about the Muslims? The Muslims do not know nor wish to say that this true Messiah who came and is acknowledged by the Christians is God and the Son of God. They nevertheless confess firmly that he is the true Messiah who was to come and who was foretold by the prophets. On this, they have no dispute with us. They say to all, at all times, that Jesus, the Son of Mary, is in truth the Messiah, and they call him the Word of God, as they do the Holy Scriptures. And they also add in their ignorance that he is the Spirit of God, for they are not able to distinguish between word and spirit, just as they do not assent to call the Messiah God or the Son of God. And this according to Maryaqu Urhaya, or Jacob of Edessa. One of the very important developments was in Iraq in between these years was the land tax assessment. And this was very important in putting pressure on people. And this was something that drove many people away from the cities where there was less restriction, and they were able to flee into villages, for example, in part because of these economic pressures. Land tax assessment in Iraq after the conquest seems to have followed the outline of the Sasanians. Surplus, even though there were changes in terminology and a distinction was now made between Muslim-owned land and that was owned by non-Muslims, and that owned by non-Muslims. The main land tax was called Haraj. The tax imposed on the land conquered populations who had not accepted Islam before the conquest and had not signed a special agreement, Sulh, was levied on most of the conquered areas. Tax assessment on Haraj land mainly followed a system called Ala al-Masaha. From a fixed portion of the land, a fixed amount of money and or crops was collected. Tax remissions may have been allowed in cases of poor harvest. But you see the development here of a new system, a system that involved really putting pressure on non-Muslim populations. So we have 750 AD, and this is the time of the Abbasids, and the Abbasids are thought to be really at the height of Islamic civilization. And much of the history of the Abbasids and the learning of the Abbasids should be attributed to the earlier civilization of Mesopotamia of the Assyrians. And one of these great achievements was something called the Beit al-Hikmah, or House of Wisdom, that has roots in the Ashurbanipal library, the school of Edessa, and the school of Nisibin, which really came before long ago, as well as the learning of the Sasanians and Persians who were, of course, who had built their civilization based on Assyrian or Mesopotamian civilization. Syria was home to a great school of Nisibin and Edessa, where medicine and philosophy were studied for hundreds of years prior to the arrival of the Abbasids. The very house of wisdom of Al-Ma'mun rested on the pillars of Assyrian Christian thinkers, physicians, translators, whose sophisticated methods of mirror translation brought Greek classics into Syriac and then into Arabic, classics which were forever lost in Greek, but found in Syriac and then in Arabic. So we have books that Assyrians had translated, Aristotle and various other philosophical works that were written in Greek were translated into Assyrian and then into Arabic. And today, some of them exist only in the Assyrian language, which is a great feat of preservation. So the Assyrians got this skill, of course, not because of outside forces, but because they themselves were interested in preserving knowledge. And the great Ashurbanipal library is one of the testamentary, archaeologically visible testament to that. Ultimately, Assyrians doomed their language through their own urban education. Arabic grows while Syriac weakens. And some of the leading people who translated works into Arabic were, of course, Assyrians themselves, and translating from Greek into Arabic, assisting in the growth and the strengthening and the enhancement of the Arabic language. And through this, they really brought about the ultimate demise of the Assyrian or Syriac language at this time. As I said, the Ashurbanipal library is said to contain twice as many literary works as the Library of Alexandria, something that is really unbelievable, considering that the Library of Alexandria came hundreds of years later. The library housed the knowledge of the ages, ancient Sumerian texts, and Babylonian mathematical formulas borrowed by the Greeks and attributed to mathematicians like Pythagoras. Now, Assyrians, of course, maintained this knowledge, and it is believed that this knowledge didn't suddenly disappear with the fall of the Assyrian Empire, but continued on, although it was, was dealt a blow, one could say, with the destruction of the Assyrian Empire. Nevertheless, we know that Assyrian art lived on and is attested to in Achaemenid art, which came hundreds of years later. And the same could be said of Assyrian knowledge. And this is where the Arabs obtained their knowledge, was from this area. Mar Timotheus is a very important character. And I will just say that, unfortunately, we don't have that much time to spend on him because there was so much to say. I'm going to have to save it for the next class. But I just want to tell you a few things about Mar Timotheus, who was a very interesting character, a great leader of the Church of the East, a diplomat. He was also an excellent administrator of his church. In 804, he called for a general synod to meet in the Caliph's capital city in Baghdad. And this had great repercussions for Assyrian history and the survival of the Assyrian Christian people during this time. As a young man, he studied under Abraham Bardash Handad at the school of Bashishu in the Aqra district, Sabsapa in the Aqra district in North Iraq. He later became a bishop of the diocese of Bagash at the metropolitan province of Adiyaban, winning the respect of Abu Musa ibn Musab and the Muslim governor of Mosul and his Christian secretary Abu Nuh al-Ambari. On the death of the Patriarch Mar II, Mar Timotheus became patriarch after some contention. There's various discussions about how Mar Timotheus became patriarch. It is thought that he used trickery. There are many stories of him saying that, for example, at this time there was an election for a patriarch. It wasn't a hereditary system. So it is said that he convinced a lot of metropolitans, which is a higher position than a bishop and is a voting position, to vote for him instead of for at least two other contenders by promising them bags of gold. He later supposedly said that these bags were filled with rocks and this seat is not to be sold. This is according to legend. We don't know if it's true or not. According to Mar Odishu, he penned more than 200 letters, but only 59 of these letters remain, of which perhaps half are edited and a handful translated. The Patriarch debated the Caliph of Islam, and this is no small feat. The Patriarch of the Church of the East had a very important position during the reign of the Abbasids. And we are told by Balmer that within a few years of cementing his patriarchy, Timothy was invited before the Caliph al-Mahdi to debate their two religions. He was not the first Christian to have argued his faith before a Muslim Caliph, or even the first Catholicos of the Church of the East. By the way, Catholicos and Patriarch are really the same thing. And I will answer questions if you have them on this position and this reference. For instance, the Patriarch Khnanishu I in 691 was brought before the Caliph Abdul Malik and asked what he thought of Islam. His response was, "It is a power that was established by the sword and not a faith confirmed by divine miracles like Christianity and like the old law of Moses." Though the Caliph considered cutting out the Patriarch's tongue, he relented, letting the Patriarch go on the condition that the church leader would never appear before the royal throne again. So he let the Patriarch go for basically telling him what he really believed. That was not the case with Mar Timotheus, who was much more of a diplomatic person. And Moffat tells us in his A History of Christianity in Asia, which is a great book, by the way, and I will send you the reference here. As the Patriarch later recorded in the proceedings, he had scarcely finished the customary complimentary address when the Caliph, quote, did something to me which he had never done before. He said to me, "O Catholicos, how can a man like you, who possesses all this knowledge and utters such sublime words concerning God, say that God married a woman from whom he begat a son?" Thus, as bluntly as when John of Damascus 40 years earlier wrote against Islam, the argument began again on the subject of Christology. But Timothy was no polemicist, and times had changed. He coolly agreed that the statement was a blasphemy. Who would say such a thing? Nevertheless, he continued, Christ is the Son of God, not, however, in the carnal way. In other words, he's defending Christianity, but he is not offending the Muslim leader. And he tells us, "And our king said to me," meaning the Caliph, "How was that eternal one born in time?" And I answered, "It is not in his eternity that he was born of Mary, O our king, but in his temporalness and humanity." And our king said to me, "There are therefore two distinct beings. If one is eternal and God from God, as you said, and the other temporal, the latter is therefore a pure man from Mary." And I retorted, "Christ is not two beings, O king, nor two sons, but Son and Christ are one. There are in him two natures, one of which belongs to the Word, and the other which is from Mary, clothed itself with the Word of God." And the king said, "They are therefore two, one of whom created and fashioned, and the other uncreated and unfashioned." And I said to him, "We do not deny the duality of natures, O king, nor their mutual relations, but we profess that both of them constitute one Christ and Son." What Mar Timotheus is saying here is really an explanation of the Diophysite nature of the Church of the East. He's explaining how the Church of the East thinks about the nature of Christ, but he is not offending the Caliph. Sidney Griffith is of the opinion that in it, Timothy voices in this debate some diffidence about the vain labor involved in such a composition, and he complains that he is carrying out the task of writing it not without difficulty nor without unwillingness. What may have proved daunting to the patriarch was the knowledge that his best apologetic efforts would carry little conviction for Muslims, nor would they do much to prevent upwardly mobile Christians from converting to Islam, especially from within his own Church of the East. So let me just focus on this at the end of the lecture, because we've gone really over the time, and I apologize. Mar Timotheus had a very important concern about his people, and that included the people who spoke his language, but he was thinking in terms of Christianity. For him, being an Assyrian, being a speaker of this language meant really also being a Christian. And eventually, as we saw, the people who spoke Arabic became really Muslims over time, and the people who spoke Assyrian or Syriac maintained themselves as Assyrians, being a part of this institution, whether it was the Church of the East or the Syriac Orthodox Church. So eventually, over time, the assimilation took hold, and despite the best abilities of Patriarch Mar Timotheus, who wrote many canons to protect his people from, for example, going to non-Christians to seek judgment, as many Christians were to do. The word here by Professor Griffith is that upwardly mobile Christians were converting to Islam. And when they converted to Islam, they left their collective entity of being Assyrians and eventually adopted Islam, not just as a religion, but also as a culture. So there were really no separate Assyrians who were Muslims. They became, in effect, Arabs.